I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Billy Abraham.
So it's very nice to come back down here to Dallas, to the low living and the high thinking, and to be able to speak on the issue of personal evil. Now, I noticed that Episcopalians are very shy, and you don't sort of come straight to the point. Here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the devil. So if you have difficulties with the devil, I sort of warn you, you can move out at this stage. And I want to begin, back in the 1960s, Time magazine ran 2 feature articles on a theologian of the period called Tom Altsizer. Now, you've never heard of him. Some of you who are theologians might have heard of him. And in the second of the pieces that was done by Time magazine, he was actually identified as basically the poster boy for the God is dead theology of the 1960s. Now, if you want a short lecture on the God is dead theology, I'll have to come back to do that. But what I'm interested in is that he wrote, over a period of time, he actually published 18 books. So he was a bit of a workaholic, obviously. But what I find fascinating, he wrote a memoir. And the memoir is called Living in the Death of God, a Theological Memoir. Now, there's a section in that, in chapter 1, which is called The Calling. Now, I'm an Irish Methodist. When everybody talks about a call, you know, you get very pious and you want to hear about how they were called by God into, going to outer Mongolia to do missionary work, or come here to Texas because they had so many sins that they needed to come and help out in the work in Texas. So I thought this is just going to be one more little pious exercise. And then I started reading it, and I want to now actually say a word about it. Altsizer was brought up in a nominal Christian family. And he joined the Episcopal Church. What other one would you join, for heaven's sake? And he considered becoming a priest. However, he failed the psychiatric exams, which actually introduces a certain nice ambiguity into what I have to say tonight. And one of his teachers at the University of Chicago said, well, that was an act of providence, because you're going to be a theologian. And you're going to be a theologian outside the church rather than inside the church. Now, what do you think of that, I'll leave for another occasion. And then he says this. I want to read this to you. Shortly before this psychiatric examination, I was in a turbulent condition. While crossing the Midway, I gather that's a street or whatever in Chicago, right? Crossing the Midway, I would experience violent tremors in the ground, and I was visited by a deep depression, one that occurred again and again throughout my life, but now with particular intensity. So hang in here with me. During this period, I had the most ultimate experience of my life, and one I believe profoundly affected my vocation as a theologian, and even my theological work itself. This occurred late at night while I was in my room. I suddenly awoke and became truly possessed. An experience of an epiphany of Satan. Now, few who read my works, by the way, I met him sometime later at the American Academy of Religion, which is a kind of annual zoo that everybody in religion goes to. And, I always worry when people deck themselves out in a sort of very special sartorial sort of elegance. And so he showed up with a very bright green jacket. And I thought, this guy's looking for attention. But I didn't say that. I was very nice about it. So anyway, few who read me know of this experience, but it is not accidental that I am perhaps the only theologian who now writes of Satan. Now you got another one who's going to write about Satan, me, and can jokingly refer to myself as the world's leading Satanologist. Indeed, he says, I'm not making this up. Satan and Christ soon became my primary theological motifs. And my deepest theological goal became one of discovering a coincidence of identity of opposites between them. Now, I've chosen this particular testimony for an obvious reason, in that it does not come from the usual sources that you would go after if you wanted to find a kind of testimony to the reality of, in fact, what he describes here as demon possession. There's actually some very interesting material in the literature. Any of you know the work of Scott Peck, has a very important book on this topic. Any of you who love the work of Hilary Mantel, very remarkable English novelist, has also written an autobiography in which he describes an encounter with the demonic. And in fact, if you read her novels, they're amazing in the kind of dark side that they explore. But Altizer is important and interesting precisely because he doesn't come from the usual stable of examples. Now, I come before you, I'm a bog Irishman. In fact, the owner of the pub here, I used to go to his aunt's shop in Enniskillen. I bought my comics and my sweets when I was a young boy in the aunt of the owner of this shop. Now, how's that for providence and coincidence? 3 cheers for Trinity Hall, right? Now, we in Ireland believe in the little people. So all this idea of there being a possibility, demons and the demonic, we just take it in our stride. I mean, the English are a bunch of skeptics. I mean, we Irish brought Methodism to America, and they came over and wrecked it. I mean, look at the mess we're in right now. It's even worse of a mess than the Episcopalians are in. But I come unapologetically to this topic for a number of reasons. First of all, because I think in the future there's going to be far more work needed to be done in this kind of territory than has been standard over the last possibly 100 or 200 years. I draw attention to the fact that the folk who really do this and do it well are those in the Catholic tradition. So if any of you here sort of are in the Roman Catholic tradition or the Catholic tradition, I never quite know what to say, 3 cheers for the Vatican, because the Vatican now actually has training for exorcists. And what's happened is that with the loss of religion in Europe, it's not meant that we all became happy and enlightened. What's happened, in fact, is that there's been a search for the occult and for what I would call the spiritual underworld, and this now requires whole new training for priests in that arena. And I also think that if you become aware of the new demographics that there is in Christianity, I mean, while Christianity is sort of losing its way in Europe and parts of North America, not all of North America, because North America is unique in this respect. But if you look at the demographics of where Christianity is spreading in sort of certain parts of Africa, in Asia, in China, and elsewhere, the issue of the demonic is actually an absolutely critical factor that if you don't know how to deal with that, you're going to be up a creek. Now, I want to acknowledge at the outset, I'm an egghead. I'm trained as a philosopher, right? Don't hold that against me. I actually have invented with some of my students at Perkins a new subdiscipline in the field of philosophy. It's called the epistemology of theology, and it is not a disease. And if you have a lot of money, you can buy the Oxford Handbook of the Epistemology of Theology. And I'm delighted to say that Jews and Muslims are reading this material, because what we've done after the revolution in the 1950s and 60s that opened up the possibility of the theistic religions, what we've done is simply provide resources whereby people can get help in sorting out truth and falsehood, knowledge or opinion in this whole arena. So I'm not advertising that material. I'm just saying I'm really thrilled to work in an area where, in fact, the product of the Enlightenment is skepticism. There's a certain sense in which we needed a cleansing of the kind of, what I shall call, theological stables of material on the demonic, because so much of it actually was very poorly thought out, and it was, in fact, in some cases, extremely dangerous. And in many cases, it was tied up with misogyny. It was tied up with opposition to women, And I think just, the Enlightenment which came through with a fundamentally skeptical orientation, it absolutely cleared out a lot of nonsense. I'll put it that. I could put it more strongly, but I won't put it any more strongly than that. Now, when it comes to our language about the demonic, it's very interesting how that language initially gets up off the ground. And there are a number of ways in which it goes. And I'm going to take, there are actually 4 ways, but I'm only going to give you 2. So I'm going to keep it tight, right? One clearly is the way in which we use the language of the demonic figuratively. On a figurative reading, speaking of the devil is a dramatic way of speaking of the natural forces of evil and our own propensity for evil. It's an attempt to deal with what I would call the lethal forms of moral evil. So think of instances where, in fact, evil is intentional, where it is systematic, where it is persistent, and where it is virtually ineradicable. These sort of forms of evil show up in people, that is, in human agents. And it shows up in the structures of evil that they invent and sustain. Now, these agents are entirely personal, human agents, but they show amazing dexterity and ingenuity. So the human agents involved, when we call someone, that's demonic, or someone sort of like within earshot of the demonic, when we use it figuratively, what we mean by that is that they take delight in evil. They perpetuate the inversion of moral values. Evil and vice are welcomed, celebrated, dwelt on, desired, loved, and passed on from generation to generation. Now, you only got to take some of the sort of really bad eggs of the 20th century. You can think of Hitler, you can think of Stalin, you can think of Pol Pot. I've just finished a biography of one of the sort of leading German figures who was alongside Hitler recently. And it was actually, you sent chills down your back. Because it wasn't just that they did evil, I'll come back to this later on, it's that they loved it. They didn't just drift into it. They dove headlong into it at that point. Which is why, by the way, when it comes to the problem of evil, my problem with God is that I have a long list of people that need to be bumped off, and they don't get bumped off. I mean, some of them actually may be on the faculty at SMU. Oh, no, I didn't mean that. I mean, you think of the problem, a lot's been made of the problem of evil, and you and I know, some of us know the literature inside out, but I mean, fact of the matter is, I do not know. I mean, it would be simple to deal with someone like Hitler, or that guy in North Korea. Now, sleep apnea for several years and let him die with a heart attack. I mean, it would be easy to get rid of these people, but they're there, and they keep going, and they breed, and they sort of extend their evil from one generation to another. And in fact, it's entirely natural when we deal with people like that we begin to speak about hell on earth. That's interesting language. We begin to speak about the end of the world. This is what we're dealing with when we deal with radical evil on the human sphere. And in fact, if you begin to reach for apocalyptic language. The stars are falling, ceasing to shine. Nature itself is being subject to cosmic convulsions, because you're having to deal with a level and a degree and an intensity and an ingenuity of evil that, in fact, requires us to reach for the language of the demonic in a figurative way. Now, I want to take it straight head on in a literal way. So if you want to accuse me of being a literalist, get over it, okay? My daughter, Siobhan, told me tonight when I was coming out, she says, if people oppose you, just offer to buy them a beer. So that's my regulation for the evening. But I want to deal with, in fact, the possibility of the demonic as a genuine ontological reality that, in fact, is dealt with in the Gospels and that has been central to the Christian tradition down through the centuries. Now, what we're talking about here is genuine personal agents who are creatures of God and who have rebelled against the good purposes of God, and who are hell-bent in destroying whatever is good in God's creation. And that includes you and me, because we, made in the image of God, have a special and incredible place in the created order. These agents are invisible, they are spiritual, and they're incorporeal. They are not therefore detected by any kind of scientific equipment, say some special sensory equipment, but they are made manifest in unusual events. That's what sort of brings them to our attention, and they're relatively rare. It's relatively rare in terms of the phenomena and the manifestation of this phenomena. And in fact, when you run into it, it gives you a pain in the brain. It really is intellectually very, very challenging indeed. Now, Hollywood, of course, has its own way of dealing with it, and I'll not get into the details there. But my own limited experience in this terrain and my own reading in this area, basically, for the most part, I think Hollywood is a waste of time. I think any of the theologians that are in fact advising Hollywood, they should be a recall, immediate recall, and I offer my services for a substantial fee for their work. Now, what you're dealing with here are what I'm going to call non-natural manifestations of personal agency. And they involve, and I'm going to repeat these a couple of times, it involves quick changes in personality represented by stark ugliness of demeanor. You will find in these circumstances, if you look at the literature and if you follow carefully the case studies, that suddenly people who have never learned a foreign language start using a foreign language. You will get gut-wrenching sneers and accusations. And you will get expressions of extreme physical force. Now here, this doesn't go beyond this meeting, all right. I have done one exorcism, and I never want to do another. And it involved precisely these kind of considerations. Now, what I'm getting at here is initially, when you confronted with this, you just get a sudden change in personality. You're looking at someone that looks perfectly normal. The one I did was at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I got a phone call saying, we need your help. Now, I had never done anything like this before. So I was up a creek without a paddle. But I knew the power of the name of Jesus. And so I went into this situation. And then just suddenly the person would change, just like that. And you had before you the manifestation of another agent with radically different purposes from what you would normally get from the agent as you knew them. And then what you'd get is you'd get alien displays of the features of a personal agent. For example, you would find that they had supernatural knowledge. They knew you were coming even though they had no access whatsoever to that information. You would find that they possessed self-consciousness of their own. They had a distinct name and identity. You discovered that they operated sometimes in tandem with other alien agents. And here was the crucial part. They expressed dramatic hostility to God, to Jesus Christ, to Scripture, to the symbol of the cross, and indeed anything that would represent the Christian tradition. Now, I didn't know, I love reading the history of theology, and some of you know Athanasius, for example, is one of my favorite theologians in the 4th century. He had his problems, but he wasn't all he was cracked up to be. But he was a first-rate politician. He was the first person ever to identify the 27 books that went into the New Testament, and he actually was brilliant in working out the theology of the sonship of Christ and ultimately prepared the way for the doctrine of the Trinity. But he has in some of his writings, he would say, well, look, how do we deal with the demons? Well, we take a cross. We start making sign of the cross in front of them. And he says they just sort of melt. And that's exactly what I saw. There would be superhuman power in which you would be driven up against the wall. and you would say, in the name of Jesus, I command you to be quiet, and they would melt right in front of you. And that's the kind of thing, therefore, that brought out what was involved in dealing with the manifestation of what I would consider to be the demonic. Now, I want, therefore, this is the sort of move I'm making at this stage, I want, therefore, to take the demonic radically seriously. And at the moment, actually, I'm supposed to be writing a paper right now on the activity of the demonic and what are the characteristic actions of the demonic and how you think that through philosophically. And I'll give you a list here of what I've got because it's sort of in my mind right now. They engage in testing us, in tempting us, in deceiving us, in causing intellectual disorientation. In fact, read Altizer's material, and you have to read it upside down and try and translate it into French, and it still doesn't make any sense. They create confusion, it creates fixation, and then it moves all the way up to, in fact, a kind of full possession where there is maximal influence and where, in fact, the character of the person is taken over in a way that we have no clue how to understand metaphysically or ontologically. Now, I've answered one question. What do I mean by the demonic? I mean two things. One, we can use it metaphorically, that language. And we reach for it when we're dealing with lethal moral evil brought about by human agents, free human agents at that point. But the more interesting language that I'm prepared to stand by is a more literal, straightforward, realistic account of this, where what you're up against is in fact an ontologically real creature who is out to destroy what God has made and what is in fact good in the world and in human beings. Now, why should we believe? I'm not asking you to take my word for it for the moment. Why should we believe this? So I want to take a minute on this. That's what the claim is. The claim is that you're dealing with incorporeal, supernatural, powerful, ingenious agents who create havoc and who ultimately, in rare cases, will take possession of people. So why would we believe such agents exist? Now here I want to drop in another quotation. One of my favorite philosophers in the 20th century is a man called Roger Scruton. If any of you have read Scruton, he's one of the masters of the English language. And he's just been knighted, by the way, by the Queen. That's pretty good. He's an unbelievable Renaissance figure. He was in Paris in 1968 at the Revolution and went down on the streets to talk to the students as to what they were up to, and it wasn't very clear what they were doing. And it made him one of the great political philosophers, in fact, of the last generation, of the current generation. And he gave a series of lectures at Princeton on human nature. Now, what I find very interesting is that when I read the lectures, the section I'm going to now share with you was not included in the lectures at Princeton. He may have made the kind of strategic decision that he would be sort of over the top. And he's a nice Englishman, and he doesn't want to be seen like a mad Irishman who believes in the little people. But here's where I want to draw you in. I'm going to draw you in, so watch out here. Scruton proposes that we distinguish people who are evil from those who are merely bad. Now this is worth pondering. Bad people are just like you and me, only worse. They belong in the community even if they behave badly towards it. We reason with them, we improve them, we come to terms with them, and in the end, we accept them. What else are you going to do but just accept them, because we're all in this together. They are made like us from what he calls the crooked timber of humanity, which is a beautiful quotation from Immanuel Kant. But he says, there are evil people who are not like that, since they do not belong in the community, even if residing in its territory. Their bad behavior may be too secret or subversive to be noticeable, and any dialogue with them will be on their part a mere pretense. There is in them, this is a powerful phenomenological description, there is in them no scope for improvement, no path to acceptance. And even if we think of them as human, their faults are not of the normal, remedial human variety, but have another and more metaphysical origin. They are visitors, he says, from another sphere. Incarnations of the devil. Wow, he's really beginning to push the envelope at this stage. Even their charm, and it is a recognized fact that evil people are often charming, is only further proof of their otherness. They are, in some sense, the negation of humanity, wholly and unnaturally at ease with the thing they seek to destroy. Now, if you don't get anything else, I think this distinction between bad people and evil people is worth taking home and sort of pondering. Now, he develops a series of contrasts to bring this home. A bad person is guided by self-interest. An evil person has selfless designs on others. A bad person, the motives are intelligible. With an evil person, the motives are uncanny, inexplicable, and even supernatural. A bad person is often open to reason. An evil person is impervious to reason or to our moral pleas. And in the case of a bad person, we are suspicious and fearful. But in the case of an evil person, we dread them. Not as the way we dread an earthquake or a hurricane or the storm we had last night. That is because they cause suffering. We dread them because they want to erase our will, our freedom, our conscience, and our integrity. In a word, they seek to destroy our souls. And in the language of Altizer, as I quoted earlier, they consume us. Now, what I'm proposing is if you begin to sort of pursue that line and then begin to look at case studies of demonic possession, then, in fact, you're going to find yourself having the difficulty of how are you going to explain these abnormal, extraordinary sort of manifestations of evil without, in fact, ultimately reaching, as Scruton is beginning to do, to the notion of the demonic. And as I've already said before, here's what's involved. Knowledge of information beyond the capacities or sources of the victim. Insane hatred of holy objects. Superhuman strength and knowledge of foreign languages. Now, in the case in which I did it, I'll mention one example that I went through. As a philosopher, you believe in reason, you believe in rationality, you believe in justification, you love epistemology, it keeps you up at night, you write books about it, you invent a whole new subdiscipline about it. So we did it in turn. We took it in turns. After about half an hour, we were sort of relaxed. And you would do, in fact, what we knew to be the case in the liturgies of the church. You would start when this manifestation would happen. You would say, okay, in the name of Jesus, I command you to give me your name. You found amazing authority. You were like a policeman holding up a badge. And at that point, the agent turned to me with this unbelievable sneer and looked at me with a look that I'll never forget and said, oh, my name is reason. I'm what you teach. And I am all over this place. Now, I'll tell you, being trained as a philosopher, that would make your hair stand on end. And I can tell you, we didn't muck around. We said, in the name of God, in the name of Jesus, I send you back to hell where you belong, out of here now. And it was over. Now, I pause there. Now, if you want to sort of say, okay, maybe this is a fraud. You going to call me a fraud to my face at this stage? Are you going to tell me I'm being delusional? Not going to work. This stuff is as real as anything I've ever met. And so what are you looking for? What's at stake here? The problem is this, or the issue is this: standard forms of clinical depression, panic, anxiety attack, psychological sort of conditions of one sort or another do not fit these cases. That's why Scott Peck, in fact, has done a lot of work in working that out. Now, let me tell you, I've lived with clinical depression in my family. I've lived with parasitosis. I've even lived with Capgras Syndrome. Most of you don't even know what that is. I know I have a degree in joint honors in psychology and philosophy. I know the difference between them, and I know what's involved in the regimen of healing. It involves biochemical considerations. It involves therapy. We know those things are vital. They're crucial. They're important beyond measure. But what you're dealing with here is way beyond that kind of thing. And how do you bring about, in fact, the change? It's by, in fact, an exorcism. And what is involved in an exorcism is not all that sort of, it's not rocket science. You insist on the name of the individual in the name of Jesus, and you expel by order those that occupy this personal space. And what you find, in fact, that what you're not dealing with a cure, you're dealing with a deliverance. And in fact, in these circumstances, you're dealing, therefore, with something, in my judgment, which is conceptually entirely different. Now, I know I'm right out on the edge with you here. I did bring a little book with me. I have other stuff here, which is advertising my missionary work, but we'll leave that for the moment. This is a remarkable book. It's called Blumhardt's Battle. And if you ever want to sort of look at this in some detail, this is the account that emerged in 1865 by a Lutheran pastor in Germany. And it's one of the most famous cases of exorcism in the history of 19th and 20th century theology. For those of you who know your theology, Blumhardt and his son had enormous influence on Karl Barth. Karl Barth's emphasis on victory over evil, which is at the center of his theology, was derived from, in fact, the Blumhardts. And this is one of the most powerful, most interesting, most authentic, most straightforward, very carefully constructed account of what was involved in an exorcism around 1865 in Germany. So I just throw that in if you think this is just sort of Abraham on a hobby horse on one of his issues. Now, what's the most serious objection to all of this? I'm sure you've thought of some of them, and I'll give you what I think is the most serious objection. I think the most serious objection is that what's involved, in the case that I've given you, or in the case here, what's involved is misperception and misdescription. We can all agree there was something going on here, but this highfalutin, highly sort of rich, ontologically sort of supernatural account, surely you want to sort of dial it down. And we ought to sort of look for a more prosaic account of what's going on. So the fundamental objection here is that what I've given you involves misdescription and misperception. Now, I want to divide that up into several elements, because this objection comes with, in fact, a series of internal sort of elements that knit together. The first move is to say that what we really have here are cases of mental illness. We're dealing with cognitive and psychological malfunction. The causal factors are not personal, but complex springs and features of human agency and subconsciousness. That's where you would start. That's where most of my teachers at Oxford were. And they were great, by the way, and they were all good Anglicans. The second move is to say that it was natural. If you were around in the first century, or if you're a bog Irishman that believed in the little people, and yeah, you may have an Oxford education, but you can't take the bog out of the Irishman. You can take him out of the bog, but you can't take him out of the bog out of him. And if you go back into earlier generations before we had the kind of knowledge that we now have, it would have been perfectly natural to describe these phenomena in terms of the demonic. The third move is to say that science gives us a much better and more accurate explanation of these phenomena, and they give us better way to provide lasting cures. Further, the fourth move is to say that, well, maybe at the moment we don't have a good explanation. Well, there are lots of things we don't have good explanations for. Capgras Syndrome, for example. What is Capgras Syndrome? Capgras Syndrome was identified by a physiologist in France, and it is cognitive malfunction via perception and memory on one person. Do you get that? There's so little research on this, we don't know what to do with it. And I'm going to be very, very open here. My wife had Capgras syndrome for 6 years. And she would phone me up and say, "Where's my husband?" I said, "I'm your husband." She didn't know me for 6 years. I talked to psychiatrists, I talked to doctors, I talked to surgeons, anybody to get my hands on, and eventually a psychiatrist said, "Oh, that's Capgras syndrome." So I went away and looked it up. Yeah, and that's what it was. And guess what happened last year? She had made up two Billies. There was two Billies. There was the Billy who either went away or died, and then there was this new Billy that showed up. And sometimes she wanted to call the police and say, "Get him out of here." So she developed a whole new profile. Okay? And the beautiful thing was, both Billies were nice. And guess what happened? She fell and broke her hip. I was lecturing on the Reformation on the Danube River. Now, there's a job for you. Didn't have to come back. She goes into rehab, and she says to my daughter, Siobhan, "When's my husband coming back?" A complete recovery of the relevant memories. Now, we have no idea what's going on here. At least, I think I have a theory about it. I think the brain was shut down and got rebooted after the anesthetic. But that's not much of an explanation. So you could say, look, we'll take all of this phenomena that you've mentioned, and over time, give us another 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years, and we'll be able to find a naturalistic account of this. So this is a misdescription. That's the fourth point. And the fifth move is to say that we know in advance that the science will really succeed in this arena. We should sort of look for naturalistic explanations. And we shouldn't therefore reach for the kind of move that I have very boldly and very sort of crassly made in this presentation. So that's at the heart of the issue of there being a misdescription and misdiagnosis. But there's another move that you'll get among theologians. They'll say, this is a demon of the gaps theory. A demon of the gaps theory is, well, this is something over here you don't understand, so we'll just attribute it to the devil. It came up in theories about the God of the gaps, in famous material in the history of theology in the 20th century. It was applied to miracles and various things like that there. Well, we don't yet know the proper explanation for it. You get a God of the gaps, and then the science fills in those gaps. Science will fill in the gaps of all this stuff. And so, Abraham, get over it. Now, as I bring this to a close, I'm going to give my response to this objection. To begin with, I do want to say that the first explanation you reach for when you deal with radical evil should be entirely naturalistic. One of the great insights of the Catholic tradition that's worked on this issue is that before you're allowed to do an exorcism in the Catholic tradition, you have to have a psychiatric examination. That is smart. Now, in the case in which I had to deal with, we didn't have time to do that. So sometimes life is just more complicated. So I think it's entirely proper that the first move is to look for some sort of naturalistic explanation in terms of the depths of evil. Further, the second thing, however, I want to say is that explanations, now stay with me, this is a bit of philosophical analysis. Explanations in terms of the nature, character, actions, and motives of personal agents is a deeply important form of explanation. Now, I'm going to be very straightforward with you. Why are you here tonight? Because you wanted a good beer. You might wanted to hear a sort of bog Irishman talking for a while. All right? Or you want to get out of the house because you have no air conditioning. That is not a scientific explanation, my friends. Scientists, when they apply for grants, are not engaged in scientific explanations. They want money to be able to put bread on the table, to take care of their families and go to Hawaii and all those good conferences that are held in the other parts of the world. Explanations in terms of personal agents, including divine agent and the demonic agent, are entirely legitimate explanations. Now, I would put it so strongly, philosophically, this way. These explanations are so deep and they're so important that they're like banks. They're too big to fail. You cannot do without them over time. So, in terms of appeal to the demonic, I'm appealing to an entirely legitimate conceptual form of explanation. So, first point was, yes, we'll hand it over to whatever psychologists or scientists or whatever want to work on it. Sure, go for it. But in appealing to explanations in terms of personal agents, this is an entirely legitimate way to go intellectually and philosophically. The third thing I want to say is that we're dealing with hard facts and phenomena here. Whenever I bring up this stuff, I've done it a couple of times on very high-powered conferences. I'm about the only one who sort of got the nerve to do it, if I may say so. In fact, sometimes I just love getting into this and watching people squirm. I mean, go to California and you've got all of these guys, who are gals who are into postmodernism and Derrida, God knows what else they're trying to make sense of. And I will, in the middle of it, drop in a whole issue of the demonic, and they don't know what to do with me. I mean, one English theologian actually at Oxford, when I last did this the last time, he sort of looked at me and he sort of said, well, there's some kind of people, they need that kind of thing. Now, as an Irishman, I was ready to get my Irish up and say, you son of a bitch, who do you think you are, you English toffee-nosed idiot who's going to dismiss this because I'm a bog Irishman? No, I didn't say any of that. But the point I want to get at here, there are real hard facts and phenomena, and they cut across cultures. I mean, the most interesting evidence that emerged initially in this field was in the 19th century by hard-nosed, very, very well-taught Presbyterians who didn't believe in any of this stuff whatsoever. And then discovered that there were reports back from the missionaries that were dealing with forms of evil that way beyond anything that they were used to. And in fact, one of the best books written on this in the 19th century was by a figure in that arena who said, we've got to come to terms with this. There's real hard facts and phenomena that you've got to deal with. That's number 3, I want to say. And then this whole idea of there being a kind of God of the gap strategy. The fact of the matter is, the appeal and the sort of commitment to there being demonic activity has been with the Christian and Jewish and Islamic tradition for hundreds of years. We're not reaching for some sort of arbitrary move at this stage. We're actually deploying resources that have long been in place in the great Western religions of the world. And so for this is not just a matter of God of the gaps. This is actually, you're bringing to the table all of your theological resources. My project as a theologian is that we've given away so much. We've given away the store. I became an atheist because there wasn't anything worth disbelieving anymore. I mean, it was all sort of like, you're like being a good Methodist. God is nice, and you ought to be nice to other people. Well, no, right? I'm going to give my life to that? And you sort of strip the Christian tradition of all of this deep material that's in the liturgies, that's in the scriptures, and the great theologians of the past. My whole work has been saying, you've given away too much. And I'm not prepared to give this up because, in fact, I think it is vital for understanding certain features of the universe and vital also for forms of ministry. So my response to this objection that this is misdescription or that it's misunderstanding and that we can provide a pure, entirely naturalistic account of it, I think it's just, I'm not convinced by that. And of course, that's where the heart of the debate eventually would be joined. Now, there's a lot of theological questions that are left over. There's a lot of pastoral questions that are left over. There's the whole misuse of the appeal to the demonic that's been the case in Western Christianity. I mean, we've got to cleanse theology of bad theology on this front. Just as we've got to cleanse theology of the anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism that's been central to our tradition for so long in the West. All that's got to be cleaned out. So I welcome all of those, all of that critical space. But I don't think that this is something that should be sort of abandoned. I think this is something that we should look at very critically. And unfortunately, of course, in the contemporary university, that's not going to happen. I would just love somebody to give me a couple of $1 million and we'll set up a private think tank and we'll go after this stuff. And then we'll publish the material and OUP will give us an opening for it. So I think this is important, and I think that there's plenty of research to be done in this domain. So I want to finish by a few final constructive comments. Here's one I want you to think about. If you give me even half a foothold on this terrain, exorcism and what involves provides striking evidence for the existence of God. All right? If you give me a foothold, I'm sort of dropping a little bombshell in your mind. You've given me very striking evidence for the existence of God, because the demonic is a creature made by God. And if this is the activity of a creature, you've got a creator. So it manifests, in fact, a very interesting case where, if you run into this, you'd better believe in God, because you're going to need God, and you're going to need the authority and power of God to deal with it. So there's a real sense in which this gives you a paradoxical kind of indirect evidence for the reality of God. The second thing I want to say as a result of this is we've got to get over being naive of what it is to be a Christian or being in the church. There's a real sense, and C.S. Lewis, that lapsed Irishman who was stolen by the English, got this. There's a real sense in which we live in enemy territory. We do not live in neutral territory. There's both the propensity to evil and there's an enemy of our souls. And if we do not take that seriously, we will be naive and we will not have the moral resources to deal with the kind of world which in fact we occupy. So I would want to say that thinking about the significance of the demonic means we've got to get beyond the Enlightenment sort of optimism. It's interesting, Immanuel Kant, who was, by the way, a pietist, a very interesting figure. Those of you who know your history of Kant. Kant took radical evil very seriously. And one of the things I regret when I was trained as a philosopher is that when you read the history of Western philosophy, I love philosophy. I teach it, I love it. I made my living by it. But what happened actually in the history of Western philosophy is that we sanitized the canon that we read. So we read Descartes and Locke, and we read Hume, and we read Leibniz, and we move on to Kant, and then we're on into the 19th century and 20th century. What was completely missed is that there's an underbelly to the Enlightenment which was siphoned out of the canon. And there's a marvelous book by a woman called Susan Nyman on the nature of evil that I would commend to you. She's not a Christian, she's not a theist, but she shows in no uncertain terms of the underbelly that the Enlightenment left with us, that's to say that the Enlightenment omitted, in which, in fact, dealing with evil is a very important feature of our human existence. By the way, the representative of this was the Marquis de Sade. You say, well, was he wasn't a philosopher. Well, that's because they told you he wasn't a philosopher. Jean-Paul Sartre is a philosopher. De Sade did his philosophy through novels. And that was all siphoned out. Or take that famous Scottish philosopher, David Hume. Terrific guy. Lapsed Presbyterian. That's a good thing to be, actually. I mean, I'll stop there. Here's what Hume said about reason. Reason is and always should be the slave of the passions. Now you just ponder that as one of the great figures of the Enlightenment, who says, in fact, that reason is totally impotent, and that, in fact, it ought to be governed entirely by our passions. Now, what I'm getting at here, therefore, is that we've got to take much more seriously than what the Enlightenment sort of, the version of the Enlightenment that, in fact, I was taught as a student, that has got to be completely and radically revisited, because there's a whole underground of evil that's got to be taken much more seriously. Now, last point, 2 points. Because you believe in the demonic does not mean you give up on free will. This is very important. Human agents are really, really sophisticated truth-detecting organisms with capacities to do this or to do that. Now that's 30 years' work I've just given you in one sentence. That solves the problem of free will, but we're not going to go there. I'm with the Episcopalians, I'm with the Methodists, and I'm not with certain other groups, that there is genuine, deep, radical freedom in the human agents. And the demonic simply represents a kind of fall into a world of radical evil, which can only be overcome by the power of God. So when it comes to my doctrine of sin, and I see Bob is pulling me to get this quit here. When it comes to my doctrine of sin, I'm an anti-Augustinian. I think Augustine got it wrong. Now, I'm not a Pelagian, although Pelagius was Irish and I want to defend him. So those of you who, that's the technical stuff. The problem with Augustine is that the depths of evil is not original sin. In fact, it is demon possession. That's when you go all the way to the bottom. Not with original sin. So that's a move I want to make. Now here's the other side of this. Redemption is going to involve the radical restoration of the image of God in us, genuine and deep victory over evil, and being so intoxicated and filled with God that transfiguration is the functional equivalent of demon possession in the Christian life. Now that requires some thinking through. But you get examples of this in the history of the church, by the way, mostly in the Eastern Church. So what I want to get at is the beauty and marvel, as far as I'm concerned, of the gospel, is that we can face this stuff without any hesitation, without any fear, because in fact, what's happened in Christ and in his resurrection and in Pentecost, we've just been through it, in Pentecost is that the power of God to defeat the forces of evil is not just talk, it's a reality. And if you've sort of not thought about that, I commend that to you this evening. Thank you very much indeed. All right, thank you so much for staying the course. And there's a series of questions about how seriously do I take this, and conceptual questions relative to what's really at stake. Do you really believe in possession? Have you seen? And the answer is yes to that one. Had you experienced exorcism prior to this particular case study that I gave you, that I gave very briefly in my own situation? No, is the answer to that. What do you think about ghosts or evil spirits? That's a different ball game. I mean, all of the sort of superstitious stuff has to be set aside. You got to take away all of that stuff about the little people and the leprechauns, and you know, all that stuff that I was brought up on in Ireland. That's folk tradition. This is much more serious stuff. So I say, leave that aside. This is a very, very powerful question. It's not a question, it's a beautifully framed comment. There's no such thing as darkness, just the absence of light. No cold, just the absence or the lack of heat. Is evil just absence of God? Now, however brought that up is a marvelous comment, because in the neighborhood of this whole debate, and where people get very nervous if they're sort of theologically well trained, and I've run into this, there's a very powerful notion that evil is simply the privation of good. It's not actually a causal reality in and of itself. And I don't believe that. That's to say, I think part of what has to be worked through here in thinking this out, Aquinas is a very careful discussion of all of this stuff. But I don't think evil as simply the absence of, say, goodness or the absence of God cuts it, because it doesn't get at the reality of the agency that you've got to deal with and the appropriate action that has to be taken. Now, that's a very technical question, but I'm sort of showing my hand on this. And there's some very good work being done on this by Jewish philosophers at Northwestern University. Here's a good question, again, opening up. It says, do you think the church has hurt people because of evil and Satan? And then it gives a case of knowing a particular individual who was badly treated by a senior person in the church. And it was inexplicable. I'd say two things here. This is why I think the whole period of skepticism was so important. Because a period in which we began to think about the world scientifically and critically and historically cleared the church of a lot of superstition, a lot of exaggeration, a lot of pious nonsense. And so I think I really welcome, because so much wrong was done in the name of the devil in the history of the church. And there are certain groups even today who are ultra-supernaturalists. And whenever they run into a problem that you disagree with them, they just say, well, you're of the devil, and that brings the thing to an end. So we've got to cut all that nonsense out. And I'm very, very hard-nosed about that. But in the cases of, just regular garden badness, there's plenty of that around. And it happens in the church. I've been through that in my own history. Others have been through it. And it's nothing to do with directly with, I would say, the demonic. It just has to do with human beings freely deciding to do evil and to do wrong and be bad and make life miserable for you. And so there's enough on that level. Yes. Did you want to raise that?
You just said something that made me. Do you distinguish between an evil person and somebody doing evil?
No. All right, the question is, do I distinguish between evil people and people doing evil? I wouldn't be able to identify an evil person if they didn't do evil.
Can a non-evil person do evil?
No. Can a non-evil person do evil? No. I mean, most of it, I love Scruton's analysis here. A lot of it, just what we're dealing with is badness. Good old-fashioned, unreconstructed badness. And I start at that level. But the evil stuff is the kind of thing where what you want to do is you take delight in destruction, and you want to consume and destroy the soul of the persons involved. This is what the Nazis did. And so you got to keep those aside as being a particular case, and don't reach too quickly for that kind of sort of evil person, or even reach for the demonic in terms of an explanation of what's going on. Did the devil fall from heaven, and is he the creator of demons, or is God who created them? And this, when people fill in the gaps on the ontology, I mean, what we do is make it up. I mean, this is what we've done to date. And the best people who've done this is, again, the Catholic tradition is by far the best at filling in the gaps. But once you get into certain details about, Lucifer and Michael, who sort of takes care of the demons and all the rest of it. I mean, what we're doing is whistling in the dark. What I'm much more interested in doing is starting from the bottom up and dealing with the reality of what I think of the phenomena that I identified here. And then just a final one, this conceptual question here, and before I move to another one. What is your view on the interpretation of the devil, less as the epitome of all evil and more as the punisher of evil? I don't think the devil is a punisher of evil. I think he encourages evil. I mean, you remember that incredible passage of the Mark chapter 3 where Jesus is accused of being in league with the devil. It's a fascinating passage. And what's going on there is that the opponents of Jesus had made the cutting remark. That's the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, means a cutting remark. And the cutting remark is, we know this smoke here, and we know where the fire is from. He's sort of done a quiet contract with the demonic. And that's how he can do all this stuff. And Christ has a very carefully scripted argument against that when he says, well, look, do you think, oh, Nick is that stupid that I'm doing exorcisms in order to sort of drive him out? So he's punishing this little devil because he didn't behave himself. So he says, look, you get to work in Dallas rather than Fort Worth. No, I don't think that anything like that is going on. But that's the kind of thing where we need to do a lot more thinking in terms of where we are. So I think that at least the conceptual framework I want to use would not be that the devil is the punisher of evil. The devil is, in fact, the one who incites, tempts, draws us into, and ultimately, in some cases, extreme cases, possesses us to do evil. Now, a couple other questions here. How common is exorcism across denominations in the Christian faith? I'll put several together. Has an Episcopal priest in Dallas of the Dallas diocese performed an exorcism? Wow. I have no idea about the answer to that one. Is there a corollary to exorcism in other faiths, Jewish and Muslim? And do other religions have exorcisms? Absolutely yes. Which in fact shows you that what we're dealing here is with a cross-cultural phenomenon. And I love the passage in the Gospels where some people have been watching the disciples doing this stuff and casting out demons in the name of Jesus and said, whoa, that sounds like a good way to do it. And the disciples said, no, we got the inside contract on that. You're not allowed to do that. And so what you find here is that exorcism was a common feature of Judaism. And it's a common feature that shows up actually across the board, certainly in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So it's another way of saying, I love sometimes I put to my students, 50,000 housewives are not all stupid. So be careful when you run into the fact that right across cultures, this material is taken very seriously. We are a kind of the exception to the rule, in part because we've been sort of taught a kind of skepticism that doesn't have any room for this kind of ontology. All right, some more here. Yeah, this is a really tough one. Why does God allow Satan and his demons to hang around? Why does God allow Satan to do so much damage? I don't get it. If demons are not mental illness, not really bad, why did God create demons? And how do you know? Epistemological question. How do you explain the concept of freedom and the existence of the devil, or how God permits the existence of the devil? Well, in a certain sense, there's no answer to that question. I mean, why doesn't God bump the whole lot of us off because of the evil we do? I mean, why does he give us so much freedom? I mean, I said this earlier. I have a long list of people where I wish God would just bump them off. I mean, a heart attack, you let them be run over by a bus. I don't care what happens. I mean, they're not fit to be around on the face of the earth given the evil that they're up to. The absolutely dastardly things that they're doing. So, at a certain level, there's a metaphysical and ontological question here. At least the opening issue is, and Calvinists and Lutherans don't like this move, but I think a world in which there is genuine human freedom, really genuine human freedom, is a much more interesting and better world in which there isn't that. And if you have genuine human freedom, you're going to have people who are going to choose the wrong way. And the thing is, we don't get to just choose simple things. Will I go to La Madeleine's or will I go to Central Market in the morning for breakfast at 6:30, right? Well, they don't open to 7 at Central Market, right? We get choices as to how we're going to live together as communities. We get choices as to how we're going to, as a nation, how we're going to spend our money on research. What are universities going to do with the life of the mind? What are we going to do in order to, for example, find out the causes of cancer? This is deep freedom. The freedom we have is not trivial stuff like whether you put jam or marmalade on your toast in the morning. The freedom runs really, really deep. And it's not just that we're given the freedom to figure out how the world itself works, then we're given the freedom to decide what to do with that knowledge. Now, that seems to me to be the reality. And if we get to the other side, why don't we have a seminar? And we can call in, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's now at Cambridge, a few other people. Leibniz, I suppose, would be handy. And we could sort of have an extended discussion on this. But the crunch issue initially is whether you really believe in the possibility of freedom as a kind of value that would be central to the work of a good and loving and wise and amazing creator. And for me, this has never been a problem. And then the problem is the limits of it. Why so much of it? And given that there's a reality above human beings in terms of demons and angels and all the rest of it, why should they be given so much freedom? I don't think we've got any straightforward answer as to what the limits of that will be. And in fact, I think wherever you draw the limits, you're always going to begin to say, well, suppose we took that freedom away. Well, why don't we take the freedom sort of further down? And then before you know what's happened, actually, you're going to have no freedom at all. So I just think you have to fish or cut bait on that absolutely crucial metaphysical question. And, I'm on board in terms of the depth of human freedom, the legitimacy of human freedom, and the beauty of human freedom. The absolute sheer wonder and beauty of freedom. And if there is a world in the angelic world beyond all of this, it seems to me I have no problems whatsoever applying that to that level as well. But we're never going to get an answer as to why it's so much, and why doesn't God intervene and just stop it? And sometimes I think, if I ask that question, well, why doesn't God bump me off? But I'll not go into the details of my sins. I think we're nearly at the end here. What was that? Yes. One more? Oh, this is perfect. One question says, what about, these are together, what about sociopaths and others? I think we've got to just let that roll as part of the research agenda that would need to be done. Which gets to the question of how would the research on the forms of evil that you would want to do, how would you do it? Well, it would be multidisciplinary. I would want top class scientists, psychiatrists, for example, sociologists who deal with principalities and powers and structures of evil and whatnot that exist in the world. I would probably want some really smart Pentecostals if I can find them. And you can find them. I would want some Jesuits on board. They're the whippets, as I said earlier, of the Christian tradition. I would want some top-notch philosophers on board. So I'd want people who are in the thick of it in missionary work, for example, and elsewhere, who've had long and extended experience of dealing with this kind of thing in very interesting situations. But then I would want the whole spectrum of medical, philosophical, theological, and other disciplinary commitments, so that in fact there would be a multidisciplinary attitude to all of this. And of course it would all have to be kept under the radar. It really would, because in fact most people would simply write you off before you even start. Now, my last comment is I've got a few cards here next Tuesday. I fly to Romania, where I'm opening up a school of theology. And I've been doing missionary work. I have 4 jobs. I have my job at SMU. I have my weekend. I do teach scripture, which is blue-collar exegesis, what I call blue-collar exegesis. I have a para-university PhD program that works through the University of South Africa, in which I have a 78-year-old Dalasite who's doing a study of the Sermon on the Mount and revising the translation of Blessed is the Poor in a way that's absolutely astonishing as a linguist. So there you go. And then lastly, I have my missionary work. So if any of you are interested in helping with some missionary work, I've got cards here. And if you've got some spare cash, I make no apology whatsoever for doing this. I work at the bottom end of the food chain in Romania with a former leader in a satanic, this is a good way to finish. He was the lead singer and musician in a satanic rock band called 666 in Transylvania. And I am not kidding you. And we have started a church in Romania and are about to start a school. So if any of you are interested in that and want to pray for it, just come up and take one of these, and you'll get the information you need on it. Thank you very much for your attention.